Welcome to the very best part of my broadcast week. You know, we love books on this show. We spend a lot of time talking to people who write books. We're going to do that again this week. The book is called The Achilles Trap: Saddam Hussein, the CIA, and the Origins of America's Invasion of Iraq. The author is Steve Coll, like doll. That's the proper pronunciation of his last name, a two-time Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, worked at the New Yorker, Washington Post. Also, I'm happy to say, because I believe in community newspapering, though it is withering across our country, the Pasadena Weekly. Steve, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining us.
I don't know how that ended up on the CV you got, but it's a true fact.
It's a true fact. As one of my journalism professors at the University of Missouri used to say, that's not just a fact, that's a true fact. This book you wrote, Steve, is it about a tragedy?
It is about a tragedy, yes. Tragedy also in the sense of, the original Greek and Shakespearean versions where protagonists hurtle towards a terrible outcome driven by flaws they're not aware of as events unfold. And that was the story of the misunderstandings that built up between Saddam Hussein and successive American presidents leading to the invasion.
So it's not just a George W. Bush tragedy.
I think it's bigger than that. I think to understand the origins of the invasion, we have to enlarge our thinking about where it came from. I think the reckoning we've had as a country about what happened between 9/11 and the 2003 invasion and the choices George W. Bush made, it's all important and it's a big part of the history, but it's hard to understand without the other side of the story, which is why Saddam Hussein behaved the way he did and how he contributed to the kind of momentum that unfolded between 9/11 and 2003. And also, even from an American perspective, to remember that we had been grappling with this man since the early 1980s, and we had embraced him at times and then separated from him and declared him to be an enemy, but that the relationship had been very complicated and full of misunderstanding all along.
Steve, I know you have sources in the intelligence community, quite obviously in the military. I have friends who served in Iraq. They are, to a person, I don't want to speak for them, but I would say, to put it mildly, they have misgivings, and in some cases they feel misused by the U.S. government. Do you think that's valid?
I think yes. I mean, I think that, look, the American public were sold on this war on the grounds that Saddam was an unacceptable threat because of weapons of mass destruction that he possessed. And our leaders told the public that they felt this war, even though it was preemptive, was necessary because they didn't want the smoking gun to turn out to be a mushroom cloud, a very vivid evocation of the dangers of a rogue regime possessing nuclear weapons. Well, then all these servicemen and women charged into Iraq, carried out the initial mission of overthrowing Saddam Hussein, and discovered there were no weapons there. Of course, they feel betrayed. They then suffered a long war fighting an insurgency in which their leaders didn't always make great decisions either. And so a lot of people did come home disillusioned. I think it has affected our country maybe more than we have been able to measure. But yes, I do understand that disillusionment.
And I want to ask you about something, Steve. Is there anything about this story, anything about this long arc of either understandings, misunderstandings, use, misuse, manipulation, missignals, that applies to a region of the Middle East right now in vast turmoil? Is there anything applicable to what the United States is trying to do with the Houthis, who are now regularly attacking cargo vessels, relations between Israel and Hamas, fears about the war expanding back to Lebanon? Anything about what this story tells that is in any way relevant or ought to inform how we're digesting the news today?
Well, yes, I would say two things quickly. One is that the invasion of Iraq and its origins um, ultimately empowered Iran and expanded Iran's relationships with allied proxies across the region, within Iraq, as we saw just recently, but also in places like Yemen and Lebanon. And the other issue that comes up a lot in the book that I think is relevant, not just to what the US government is trying to manage in the Middle East today, but also, in the conflicts that Israel is involved in, is this question of, you have a lot of actors in the Middle East who break international norms, who can be aggressive, who can cross borders. Saddam Hussein invaded two of his neighbors without provocation, Iran and Kuwait. And it can leave the impression that some of these actors are just unmanageable, completely unmanageable. One of the lessons from Saddam's case, and it is unusually well documented because he tape recorded his leadership conversation, so we can now look back and see what he was thinking and saying at pivotal moments, is that even an aggressor with his erratic record can be deterred if you signal clearly enough to them what the consequences of their action will be. I mean, it's a big mystery as to whether Hamas, given the kind of attack it carried out on October 7th, was deterrable. But they
Mhm.
clearly were not deterred. And there's a big debate in Israel right now about why that was. And what's interesting in Saddam's case is that the record shows that even though he looked from the outside maybe to be undeterrable, he was just going to do what he wanted to do for his own reasons. In fact, if you told him you're going to lose your regime, you're going to lose your life if you do X, he steered away from X and said, I'll live to fight another day.
And Steve, I want to double back on the point you made about the after effects of the 2003 invasion, empowering Iran and expanding the reach and the menacing character of these allied or relationship built militia groups throughout the region. Would we be in a better place vis-a-vis that had we not invaded?
I mean, it's hard to run a full counterfactual history across such a long period of time in such a complicated environment, but it was the premise of US policy from the time of the Iranian Revolution until 2003 that we could not afford to break apart Iraq because Iran would exploit the vacuum. That was that we needed a strong Iraq, a unified Iraq, even one run by a rogue like Saddam Hussein, in order to counterbalance Iran. And that an unbalanced Iraq that lost military deterrence against Iran would be exploited by Iran. That was, the policy of the Reagan administration, the H.W. Bush administration, and somewhat the Clinton administration as well. And now we can see that they were right, that Iran was ready to fill up any vacuum that opened up in Iraq, and our invasion, by not just toppling Saddam Hussein, but dissolving the army of Iraq, because it was tainted politically through association with Saddam, and dissolving the Ba'ath Party, the most extensive political structure in the country. We did create a vacuum that Iran has filled partially.
And in some cases, dangerously so, and remains a bedeviling part of the international policy matrix for every president. It was a bedeviling part of the matrix for President Trump. It's a bedeviling part of the matrix for President Biden. Steve Coll is our special guest. The book, as you can see over my shoulder, The Achilles Trap, Saddam Hussein, the CIA, and the Origins of America's Invasion of Iraq. When we come back for segment two, I'm going to start by asking Steve kind of a meta question about the year 1979 and so many things that played out across the Middle East that we live with today. I'm Major Garrett, segment two of The Takeout in just a second.
The roots of 9/11 do trace back to 1979.
Welcome back to The Takeout. Steve Coll is our very special guest. The book, The Achilles Trap, Saddam Hussein, the CIA, and the Origins of America's Invasion of Iraq. I promised a meta question, Steve. 1979, it strikes me as a kind of year that looms enormously large in America's history of dealing with this particular region, the Middle East. Let me just tick down the things I know you know well, but I want you to give a contextual answer to my audience about why these things all matter, even in the rearview mirror. Obviously, Saddam Hussein becomes president and prime minister of Iraq in 1979. U.S. intelligence discovers that Pakistan is pursuing a nuclear weapons program in 1979. The democratically elected president there is hung, setting off a series of military dictatorships. 1979 in November, extremist Saudis seize the Grand Mosque in Mecca, prompting a rightward shift of the Saudi royal family to subsidize, among other things, Sunni religious schools. There are elements of 9/11 that you can find traced back to there. The Shah of Iran is allowed into the United States. The Iranian Revolution begins in 1979. And after a coup in Afghanistan that is led by communist forces, the Soviets invade Afghanistan to protect that fragile regime. The United States government under President Carter covertly funds the Mujahideen. Add all those things up, and am I right to say that 79 is the year we should circle on all of our calendars as when things shifted there and U.S. policy remains affected in profound ways?
Absolutely. I mean, you make a pretty persuasive case, even adding a couple of things to the list I wouldn't have had on the top of my head, but you're absolutely right. I mean, it's remarkable, isn't it, how years can get so packed with events. Maybe when you're living them, you don't recognize what a pivot point they were. I do remember we all understood that 1989 was a pivot point when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union started to crack up. Everybody was writing at the time, wow, this is one of those moments in world history. Well, 1979 was at least as significant, but less obviously so at the time, except for the succession of crises. And you might have added, I think, that the second oil embargo took place then, when America experienced a
Right.
huge price shock and got tipped toward recession. But I would say what we really can see in retrospect, which wouldn't have been as obvious at the time, and you alluded to it, is that the roots of 9/11 do trace back to 1979. And I think, you know, from the perspective of what I've been working on for the last few years, the roots of 2003, the invasion of Iraq, also trace back to 1979 because Saddam came to power. The Iranian Revolution brought to power in Tehran a government under Ayatollah Khomeini that was hostile to Saddam. And that caused Saddam the next year to invade Iran, setting off the Iran-Iraq War. And that in turn ended up drawing the United States, first the Reagan administration and other successive presidents, into this tangle with Saddam that just became more and more problematic as the years passed.
And you vividly document how involved the Reagan administration was with Saddam and how, even to the degree of sharing previously unshareable or unshared intelligence with the Iraqis about where Iranian positions were to help them continue to prosecute their side of the war.
Yeah, that whole episode, and the reason that I went back and excavated it and tried to narrate it in a readable way for Americans is because that was where the seeds of confusion and misunderstanding that ultimately led to the Iraq War of 2003 really began. And you know, you mentioned the key element. Saddam invades Iran and gets bogged down. In 1982, the Reagan administration is monitoring the war with satellite photography, and they panic because they see that the Iranians might be about to break through Iraqi lines, drive on Baghdad, and hang Saddam from the nearest post. And that's what Ayatollah Khomeini had pledged to do. They didn't want that outcome because they feared the expansion of the Iranian Revolution, just as we were talking about before. So they sent a CIA officer into Baghdad with secret satellite photographs of Iranian war positions, offered them to Saddam and said, look, we don't want you to lose this war. You need to use these photographs. But Saddam never trusted the pictures. And he always thought the Americans were double dealing and that they were probably, if the photographs were reliable at all, that they were probably giving the same ones about him to the Iranians. And then 4 years later, we had the Iran-Contra scandal. And you remember what that revealed. It revealed that, in fact, he was right. We were double dealing, at least for a time. And there are these, he tape recorded his leadership conversations, and it's a whole lot of new information about this history. And there are these amazing tapes after Iran-Contra is revealed where he says to his comrades, look, I told you all along, you guys thought the Americans were being honest with us. No, they weren't. And that conviction stayed with him for many years. There are tapes much later in the 90s where he's trying to figure out what the Americans are doing or what he should do, how much he should cooperate. And he says to his colleagues, like, just remember, what was revealed in Iran-Contra is still the way the world is organized. There's a deep conspiracy against me. It involves the Americans, the CIA, the Israelis, and Ayatollah Khomeini. He genuinely thought Khomeini was a client of the United States, that we had deliberately created the Iranian Revolution. As wacko as that may sound, you would have had a hard time persuading him otherwise.
Steve, I'm always delighted to remind myself I have what we would regard as youngsters in this audience, meaning people in their 20s and 30s. They might not remember or have any real sense of Iran-Contra. They might have watched, as I recently did, Only Murders in the Building. In one of the seasons, it's not a throwaway line. It's actually a name-checking of people who were significant in Iran-Contra. And the punchline of this name-checking back and forth between Martin Short and Steve Martin is Iran-Contra. It was bigger than Watergate, just not as interesting.
I actually think that it was even more interesting than Watergate, but that just says more about me than about the scandal. But should we just very briefly
Yes,
describe
please.
what this was? Okay,
Please.
so Iran's revolutionary proxies in Lebanon had taken hostages, including Americans, and held them. They had kidnapped, in addition, the CIA station chief in Beirut, tortured him to death. And the fate of the hostages weighed heavily on Ronald Reagan. The Israelis, meanwhile, were trying to cultivate influence with the Iranian Revolution by selling them weapons under the table to help them in their war with Iraq. The Israelis invited the Reagan administration into a partnership that was designed to persuade the Iranians to use their influence to release American hostages in Lebanon in exchange for weapons and intelligence, satellite pictures about the Iraqi positions. And so the Americans did this. There was the Contra part of the title refers to the fact that they used the profits from the arms sales to illegally fund anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua, but we'll save that for another podcast. For our purposes, the Iran part was this deal basically to try to free that. It was basically a ransom payment through complicated means, and it didn't work. It didn't work, and it was exposed, and it shocked the American people. It exposed what became prosecuted as federal crimes, and it stunned most of our allies in the Arab world, except for Saddam Hussein, who was the only one who woke up that morning and said, "I told you, this was exactly what I predicted."
And if I read your book carefully, Steve, as I tried to, it informed Saddam's judgments about the U.S. evermore.
It did. It did for a long time, and the evidence of that is on these tape recordings, where many years later, and I think you'd have to spend as much time as years that I spent kind of inside his head, going meeting by meeting through these transcripts. But I just remember going, aha, much later, reading in the 90s what he was saying to his colleagues. He would refer back to Iran-Contra as almost the sort of critical pivot point in his convictions about the United States and his relationship with the United States. But also it reaffirmed for him deeply held conspiracy theories that he had that were not well grounded, but that he believed nonetheless, about the US, Israel, and Iran being lined up against him, and there being a kind of invisible alliance in the world that was shaping events.
That is the voice of Steve Coll. The book, The Achilles Trap, Saddam Hussein, the CIA, and the Origins of America's Invasion of Iraq. Segment 3 of The Takeout coming your way in just one moment.
He was also a complicated individual who managed to rule as much through kind of gifts and patronage and charisma as he did through terror.
Welcome back to the Takeout. Steve, you've referred to this a couple of times, but I want you to do my audience the courtesy and give yourself the benefit of describing this never before seen information for at least an American or Western audience about these tape recordings of Saddam Hussein. But before you do that, for those who may wonder, was Saddam as brutal as American officials described?
Yes, he was. I mean, he waged war against his own people, in addition to being an aggressor in two unprovoked conflicts with his neighbors. He invaded Iran, and then during the war that followed, lasting 8 years, in which 1 million people died, he broke international norms by using chemical weapons, mustard gas, and sarin against Iranian troops. Then, faced with rebellions among his own Kurdish people, he gassed his own Kurds, killed tens of thousands of people at a time, ultimately was hung for war crimes associated with some of that, or his colleagues were. And then, he ran a secret police force that imprisoned and tortured many tens of thousands of Iraqis. So yes, he was a very brutal dictator. He was also a complicated individual who managed to rule within his Ba'ath Party as much through kind of gifts and patronage and charisma as he did through terror. Both were part of his game plan for remaining in power for such a long time in such a dangerous neighborhood. But what's so remarkable is that he has left us a record of the inner workings of a dictatorship, the likes of which we've not seen anywhere in the post-Cold War world, certainly post-war world, because he tape recorded his conversations as often as Richard Nixon, thousands of hours of tapes. And they're remarkable. They're really remarkable. I mean, so they're of great historical interest, but they're funny and scary and confusing and very interesting materials to spend time with.
And I heard in one of your other podcasts that when you see the show The Sopranos, you see a Saddam Hussein.
Yes, I was working on this during the pandemic. And so during lockdown, like a lot of people, kind of pulled out some old TV series to pass the time. And my wife and I watched The Sopranos, and we were season 1, episode 2. I was like, oh, that's Saddam Hussein, Tony Soprano. That's exactly what he's like. And he did have a similar kind of problem of ruling through family who were highly unreliable. But anyway, yeah, that is a pretty good thumbnail place to start with him. I think what matters to us looking back at it, given the tragedy of the Iraq War and the cost so many American families paid for that war, is to ask, beyond what the Bush administration chose to do and how it communicated about the war before 2003, there's also the question, why did Saddam Hussein surrender his own power, his own regime, ultimately his own life, for the sake of weapons that he didn't possess? So why did he create this impression that he was so dangerous? And when he knew it was going to cost him. And you go back through the Bush administration transcripts, there's a moment where George W. Bush is thinking out loud about his own dilemmas with his kind of war cabinet. And he asked the same question. He says, the reason I'm sure he has the weapons is if he didn't have them, why would he create the impression that he did? Because I'm about to invade him. So, the confusion is even made explicit, but the answer to that question is in the tapes. It's not like one sentence answer, but it's embedded in this conflict that he had with the United States, and even with the confusions dating back to Iran-Contra in the 1980s that we were discussing before.
And that answer is, in a nutshell, Steve, the answer to that question that even George W. Bush posed?
Partly, it was he feared showing weakness. Mm-hmm. He feared that if he admitted clearly and unambiguously that he was disarmed of dangerous weapons, that Iran might attack him, that Israel might attack him, or that his own generals might move against him as a weakened figure. He lived in continual fear of assassination, and not without reason. A lot of people were trying to get after him, including his own rivals within Iraq. So that desire to maintain ambiguity, to project strength was an important factor. He also had an enormous amount of pride and ambition, and he saw himself as a leader of the glorious leader of the Arab world. And some of the disarmament demands would have required him, if he fully complied, to, in his way of thinking, humiliate himself publicly, which he just wasn't going to do. He would rather go down in a ball of flames than humiliate himself in front of his own people or the Arab world. And so he hesitated when he had those options, even though they might have gotten him out of a box. He wasn't going to present himself that way publicly.
Steve, all of us in this business rely on the help and assistance of others. You open your book with acknowledgments. I want to give you a moment to thank those on your team that helped you with the translation process and all the other things related to these amazing transcripts.
Yeah, I should thank you. I mean, I should first start with the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, which is a nonprofit that a lot of news organizations benefit from. And I was lucky to get their pro bono help because I had to file a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit against the Pentagon in order to obtain these records that we've been talking about. And without them, I don't think I would have succeeded. I also had help from a couple of amazing young journalists, Sarah Mawad and Amal Brahmi, as well as some scholars who helped me with to make sure that my use of the English language translations was accurate. I didn't want to rely on government translations or other people's work, so we went back and went over it all ourselves as best we could. And yeah, it definitely was a passion project for more than me for a few years. I had some great partners.
Steve, is there anything that Americans should know about how Iraq sees itself, either in its history, its civilization, its role in the world now?
Well, I think Iraq, although it was in some ways an artifice created out of British and Ottoman periods of imperial rule, grew into a state informed by strong national identity and aspiration. And, as I'm sure you know from covering the war after 2003, Iraq was a middle-income country that had used its oil wealth, despite the wreckages of wars that Saddam Hussein had unnecessarily started, to create a middle class, a well educated scientific and technical class. And indeed, one of the reasons why they posed such an apparent threat, and in the 80s at least, an actual WMD middle income power, was because they had the scientific and technical capability to build complex weapon systems and came close to finishing a nuclear weapon on their own without a lot of outside help. So this was a proud society that, Saddam, we used to ridicule Saddam, and for good reason, of thinking himself as like the next Babylonian ruler, but
Mm-hmm.
it was an heir to the Babylonian civilization. And like Egypt today, which, doesn't hesitate to see continuity between ancient Egyptian civilization and modern Egypt, so Iraq has a strong sense of national civilization that dates back millennia.
We have about a minute. I'll give you a start on this. We'll pick it up on the other side of the break. The importance of the first Gulf War in Kuwait.
It was the huge turning point. It was the conflict that irrevocably transformed Saddam from a tentative ally, friend, frenemy of the United States and a client of the CIA into a hardened enemy, a kind of Fidel Castro figure of the Middle East.
That is the voice of Steve Coll, the book again, and it is excellent. I highly recommend it. The Achilles Trap, Saddam Hussein, the CIA, just name-checked, and the origins of America's invasion of Iraq. When we come back for segment 4 of The Takeout, Steve and I are going to talk about something that persists in American memory but might not be true. Did the Iraqis actually try to assassinate George Herbert Walker Bush? That when we come back.
Al-Qaeda was hiding in plain sight, carrying out successful terrorist attacks on U.S. targets.
Welcome back to the Takeout, Steve. That question I left hanging as we went to break. Did the Iraqis try to assassinate George Herbert Walker Bush?
Probably not, is the conclusion I come to after examining all this new evidence. Just to briefly recap the mystery, you
Yes.
mentioned murders in the building. This would be a good murders in the building, actually. Um, so, uh, in 1993, after his presidency, George H.W. Bush visited Kuwait, the country he had liberated through war after Saddam had invaded it and occupied it. And he was welcomed by the emir. He had with him his son, Jeb, and Laura Bush, George W.'s wife, among others in his entourage. The emir threw a big banquet. George H.W. went around Kuwait City and gave some talks. And then his whole team flew away without incident after their 2 or 3 day visit. A week later, the Kuwaitis announced that they had foiled an assassination plot while he was there. As evidence, they pointed to a vehicle bomb, an SUV bomb, that they had discovered in a warehouse in Kuwait City. And they said it had been wired up by the Iraqi intelligence services. Then they displayed some Iraqi-born whiskey smugglers who they arrested and who they said were part of the plot. Well, this was shocking, generated a lot of headlines. Saddam tries to kill H.W. Bush in revenge over Kuwait war. That was the essence of the news reaction. It got a lot of attention, understandably. And so the FBI and the CIA were dispatched out to investigate this. So they concluded, first of all, that that vehicle bomb was definitely an Iraqi car bomb because there were a bunch of those vehicles parked around the Gulf before the end of the Kuwait war. And this one conformed to the others. However, there was no particular reason to think that that bomb hadn't been in Kuwait for years prior to George H.W.'s visit. That would have also fit the pattern of the other bombs it was like. As to these whiskey smugglers, I mean, they had been subject, no doubt, to less than polite treatment in interrogation. They were low-level non-professionals. And the story they told about their supposed instructions to, get close to HW with this vehicle just really didn't pass the smell test for a lot of people who examined the details. And in fact, Sandy Berger, who was then Clinton's deputy national security advisor and who was running the review of what should be done, argued that the Kuwaitis, understandably, had just found this vehicle bomb and decided to tell a damaging story about Saddam Hussein, who had, after all, ransacked their country. But President Clinton, reviewing other evidence, I mean, there were other advisors who said, well, the circumstantial evidence is strong enough to retaliate. He did retaliate, though not in a very significant way, sent some cruise missiles into Baghdad. So now we get to the new evidence in these tapes. So there are not only thousands of hours of tapes, but many other documents from the intelligence services of Saddam Hussein and others, and researchers who have access to everything, which I did not, because I had to file a FOIA suit to get what I had.
Right.
They have done word searches of the entire record in Arabic, looking for any term that would indicate that this plot to kill H.W. Bush somehow resided in the Iraqi bureaucracy, and there's just no evidence of it. Now, you can say you can't prove a negative, but to me, the preponderance of it all is that Sandy Berger was right, that this was a Kuwaiti information operation, not a real assassination plot.
And yet it influenced policy for years.
Well, it did. I mean, it certainly helped to paint Saddam into a corner of, absolute rogues, so ruthless, like Vladimir Putin, that he would, even more ruthless than Vladimir Putin, who's never tried to kill an American president. I mean, there's not too many dictators in the world who have been caught or accused of specifically trying to assassinate an American president. And yeah, he didn't have a great reputation to begin with, but that certainly exacerbated it.
The book points out something that I think history forgets. The Clinton administration policy in its latter years was for regime change in Iraq. Steve, I argued in a book I wrote reviewing the 1994 midterm elections called the Enduring Revolution that Republican control of Congress and orientation toward Iraq and pressure on the Clinton administration about that policy are aligned, meaning Republicans were beefing up their appraisal of this issue, repeating the story about the attempted assassination attempt on H.W. Bush, and pressing the political narrative about Iraq in ways that I believe influenced the Clinton administration around this policy. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think the record shows that. I think that, and remember, Clinton was politically struggling in some respects after the Gingrich Revolution, and he certainly was aware that he had a sort of political fight on his hands. And in his second term, he was also frustrated by the kind of stalemate that had developed with Saddam. It was expensive, it was annoying, it was repetitive, and he had never wanted Iraq to be central in his foreign policy. And so he did allow a kind of hardline view to take over, I think partly hoping that it would get Congress off his back. But in November 1997, he sent Madeleine Albright out to deliver a White House approved speech, which told Saddam, it doesn't matter if you disarm, it doesn't matter if you verifiably destroy your nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons programs, our policy will remain that no sanctions relief will take place until you're gone. And so that was as clear in a regime change policy as Clinton could have announced. Domestically, it might have bought him some time and space, but with Saddam, it made clear that he had no incentive any longer to cooperate with inspections. And he threw out the inspectors the very next year. And the blindness that followed contributed to the gaps in knowledge that led to the Iraq invasion in 2003.
Did this fascination bordering on obsession with Iraq blind us to the potential threats that led to 9/11?
Yes, I think it did. A lot of our capacity for intelligence collection, for forward presence, the allocation of our presence in the Middle East to contain enemies was focused on Iraq. Al-Qaeda was hiding in plain sight, carrying out successful terrorist attacks on U.S. targets starting in the summer of 1998, most visibly in the twin bombings of U.S. embassies in Africa, followed by barely thwarted plots to attack the U.S. In Seattle and Los Angeles and other targets in the Middle East. And then, of course, the USS Cole attack in October of 2000. So, these were real events. In Saddam's case, the arguments were about a very expensive and prolonged search for something that people couldn't put their hands on, which were his supposedly hidden stocks of dangerous WMD. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to be scientific about the relationship between the missed opportunity, but I think it's a fair observation to make.
The voice of Steve Coll, the book, The Achilles Trap, Saddam Hussein, the CIA, and the Origins of America's Invasion of Iraq. This concludes the Takeout. Stay tuned for your Takeout Outtake Especial. We'll see you next week.
I was so influenced by the Vietnam era of journalists who had covered the war on the front lines, then came back and wrote about its origins.
Welcome to your Takeout Outtake Especial. You know, everyone, this is the fun and games part of our conversation. I grant you Steve Coll's book, The Achilles Trap, Saddam Hussein, CIA, and the Origins of America's Invasion of Iraq. Not necessarily a fun and games topic, but we always make the transition smoothly. Steve, we have 3 questions we've asked everyone on this show, going on 8 years, so take them in whichever order you prefer. Most influential book in your life and why? If you're going to list one of your all-time favorite movies, what would it be? And if you're on a long flight or a long drive and you're going to really enjoy some music, what artist or genre is that most likely to be?
Okay. Movie's the easiest one. Dr. Strangelove. my absolute world favorite movie. I mean, I've only seen it like 6 or 7 times. I still laugh like a crazy person.
You can't
And so,
fight in here. This is the war room.
yes, yes, and there's so many lines that, unfortunately, in this dark world of ours, continue to be
Yes.
funny and relevant. Uh, I have listened to jazz most of my life, quartet acoustic jazz mainly, but piano music. So yeah, probably Bill Evans.
Mhm.
If the problem is the plane is awfully noisy, so
Yes, right.
sometimes it's hard to hear.
You got to have the noise cancelers. You got to have
Yeah,
the noise cancelers.
yeah. And then books that influenced me. I mean, really, I would have to say Bright Shining Lie by Neil
Mhm.
Sheehan, because when I was in college, I was so influenced by the Vietnam era of journalists who had covered the war on the front lines, then came back and wrote about its origins in, American decision making and all the deceptions and misunderstandings. And that really inspired me as a young person to say, that's what I want to do if I can ever get the opportunity. And Bright Shining Lie is one of many great books from that era, but maybe the single
Mhm.
most distinctive. So,
Unquestionably. And ladies and gentlemen, if you are a fan of that book, as I am, or David Halberstam, or even I would say, and this is a different type of explanatory journalism, Tom Wolfe,
mm,
very different. But those are three of the authors who most influenced me as I thought about becoming a journalist. I've never reached that grandeur. Steve Coll has reached that level of grandeur. So if you're fans of those books, I encourage you not only to take a look at the Achilles Trap, but all of other of Steve's tremendous work. Steve, great pleasure to talk to you. Thanks so much for your time, and I appreciate your being with us.
thank you, Pedro. Just a joy to be with you. Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next week, folks.